So it is with transubstantiation. The dogma of purgatory is another abomination. Vatican II says that although Christ suffered to bear our eternal punishment, we must personally suffer to expiate the temporal punishment due for our sins. Quote, sins must be expiated through the sorrows, miseries, and trials of this life, or in the next life through fire and torments or purifying punishments. In purgatory, the souls of those who died in the charity of God and truly repentant for their sins and omissions are cleansed after death with punishments designed to purge away their debt, unquote. Yet Peter himself declared that Christ has, quote, once suffered for sins, he the just for us the unjust, that he might bring us to God, not to purgatory. There's a further contradiction. Although Catholicism says we must personally suffer, it also says we don't have to. Masses and rosaries can be said even after one's death to reduce one's suffering in purgatory. For those who die wearing the brown scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and fulfill certain other obligations, she will go into purgatory the Saturday after their death and take them out to heaven, so they don't have to personally suffer. Christ's sacrifice on the cross was not sufficient, but its alleged repetition in the Mass, if done enough times, will eventually get one to heaven. Moreover, good Catholics may offer their sufferings to release souls from purgatory. Padre Pio manifested the stigmata for 40 years to pay the penalty for the sins of the world so that souls could be released from purgatory. Of such alleged saints, Vatican II says, quote, they have carried their crosses to make expiation for their own sins and the sins of others. They were convinced that by their suffering they could help their brothers to obtain salvation from God, unquote. Again, we see the denial of the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. For centuries, the payment of money brought deliverance from purgatory. That practice eventually troubled Martin Luther's conscience and sparked the Reformation. Who can forget the infamous sales pitch of the Dominican friar Tetzel, commissioned by Pope Leo X to reap a fortune from Rome? Quote, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, unquote. This was nothing new. Rome had consistently sold salvation for centuries. Popes published lists of every crime from incest to piracy to murder, with a price for which the church would give absolution for each. For example, a deacon guilty of murder could be absolved for 20 crowns. The anointed malefactors, as they were called, once pardoned by the church, could not be prosecuted by civil authorities because the church reigned supreme. Here's a further abomination filling the woman's cup, selling tickets to heaven, which actually send people to hell. Similar practices continue in Roman Catholicism to this day. This is a Mass card obtainable from any mortuary. Fill in your name and the name of the deceased, and in exchange for an offering, the priest will place the card on the altar when he says Mass, allegedly reducing the time of suffering for the deceased in purgatory. Of course, the Church makes no guarantee how much the suffering will be shortened, nor how many more Masses must be said before the gates of heaven can be opened. Consequently, multiple Masses are purchased, hoping that eventually there will be enough. A friend's father died recently, and he told me that $2,000 in Mass cards were purchased at the funeral. Now, some Catholics claim they don't believe in indulgences, but Vatican II declares the Church teaches and commands that the usage of indulgences, a usage most beneficial to Christians and approved by the authority of the sacred councils, should be kept in the Church. And it condemns with anathema those who say that indulgences are useless or that the Church does not have the power to grant them. There are 20 complex rules governing indulgences. Rule 17 explains that the use of a crucifix, rosary, scapular, or medal, quote, can gain a partial indulgence, but if this object of piety is blessed by the Pope or any bishop, the faithful who use it with devotion can also gain a plenary, that is, a full indulgence on the feast of the apostles Peter and Paul. Here is another abomination filling that gold chalice. What kind of God grants favors depending upon whether a priest or a bishop has blessed some scapular or medal, and whether it is used on a feast of Peter or Paul, and favors, remember, which the sufferings of Christ upon the cross could not procure? Speaking of abominations, the woman is called the mother of harlots. As well as spiritual harlots, Roman Catholicism has created literal harlots by the millions. Supposedly celibate priests, bishops, cardinals, and popes without number throughout history have had their lovers. There were popes who were the sons of supposedly celibate popes. Pope Silverius was fathered by Pope Hormisdas, and John XI by Sergius III. The list of bastards who ruled the church includes Popes Boniface I, Gelasius, Agapetus, Theodore, Adrian IV, and others. No wonder Pope Pius II, who himself fathered illegitimate children, said that Rome was, quote, the only city run by bastards. For centuries, it was a favorite joke that Rome had more prostitutes than any other city because she had the most celibates. The sexual exploits of supposedly celibate priests and nuns, once hushed up, are increasingly coming out in the open. The Archbishop of Vienna recently stepped down after being charged with sexual abuse of minors. The Bishop of Basel, Switzerland, too, resigned after admitting to an affair with a woman whom he made pregnant. The resignation of Ireland's Prime Minister and collapse of its government was recently precipitated by exposure of 40 years of the Catholic Church and Catholic government officials covering up the continued sexual abuse of a pedophile priest. Homosexual priests are dying of AIDS worldwide, with estimates that as many as 70% of priests in some seminaries are practicing homosexuals. The Roman Catholic Church in America has paid out an estimated $1 billion in the past few years in out-of-court settlements to cover up its clergy's sexual abuse. The Franciscan Seminary in Santa Barbara, California, recently had to shut down because of the sexual involvement of its priests. The Milwaukee Archdiocese is in serious financial trouble due to payments it has had to make for out-of-court settlements involving its priests' sexual affairs. The Archdiocese of Santa Fe, New Mexico, is on the brink of bankruptcy because of the lawsuits against it for priestly sexual abuse and the fact that Lloyd's of London and other insurance companies refused to pay the malpractice insurance because the Archdiocese attempted to cover up the affairs. I have a file nearly 2 inches thick of news articles involving sexual immorality of Roman Catholic clergy just within the past 2 years. It's not that Catholic priests and nuns are any more lustful than the average person. They may have started out with higher ideals, but they have had imposed upon them the unbiblical rule of celibacy, which becomes a burden too great to bear. The woman, too, is drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. For centuries, to disobey the popes was heresy, punishable by death. J.H. Ignace von Dollinger, a leading 19th century Catholic professor of church history, confessed, quote, "Since 1183, the view of the church had been that every departure from its teaching must be punished with death, and the most cruel of deaths by fire," unquote. For 1,000 years before the Reformation, there were Christians who refused to give allegiance to Rome and who were slaughtered by the millions. Everyone knows of the Crusades to retake the Holy Land, but few know that even larger and more numerous crusades were fought to exterminate Christians all over Europe, who out of conscience to God and obedience to the Bible would not submit to the authority of the popes or embrace Rome's heresies. Of these martyrs, historian Will Durant wrote, quote, "The Roman Church, they were sure, was the whore of Babylon," unquote. Such was the opinion of the Reformers, written into the Reformation creeds. One could hardly come to any other conclusion from John's vision, yet that opinion is being abandoned by evangelicals in the interests of ecumenism.